Hi, this is part 2 of my video, Marxism and the development of scientific socialism. In the last video I described currents of utopian socialism, early 19th century Europe, conspiratorial movements, and the early development of the early workers' movement in Britain. Now, Karl Marx himself was born in Trier, Germany, which was at the time was a liberal Catholic part of Germany. It had been influenced by France, which was the traditional center of the Enlightenment of revolutionary movements. Marx himself was born in 1818. Now, Marx grew up in the shadow of some huge cataclysmic events in Europe. There was the French Revolution, and then the Napoleonic Wars, which from 1789 to 1815, it upended everything. There were revolution in France, the old order was overthrown, there were more or less revolutionary armies led by Napoleon, conquered Europe, and then were pushed back. The old order, the old ruling classes attempted to put themselves back in power. It wasn't quite the same thing. There was also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, all these things going on. And Marx grew up in the shadow of this. Marx was from a Jewish background. He came from a long line of rabbis. His grandfather was a rabbi. His father converted to Lutheranism, like kind of nominally became a Christian so he could practice law. Trier, or the area of the Rhineland, Germany, it was liberal Catholic in the settlement that had been developed after the end of the Napoleonic Wars. That area was given to Prussia, which was in eastern Germany, Berlin, which was Protestant, highly militaristic. People call it like not a state with an army, but an army with a state. Highly militaristic. A military that was based on the feudal large landowners. So it was an odd combination. For a while it seemed to work, but it was a really odd combination. So there was a lot of ferment going on at the time. So as I said, Marx was born in 1818, a few years after the Napoleonic Wars. Now, a big influence around that time was the philosopher Hegel, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Hegel was lived from 1770 to 1831 and taught at the University of Berlin, early 1800s, the peak of his career. He was the culmination of German idealism, of a long line of philosophers. Basically, Hegel had a philosophy of historical change through the collision of opposites, kind of a dialectical process. Vast collision of ideas, which were worked out over long periods of history. And Hegel was an idealist. These collisions of ideas, historical collisions, were in the realm of pure idea. And someone, I forget who it was, but someone in the history of philosophy said Hegel was the German equivalent of the French Revolution. Since Germany was more backward, it couldn't carry out a revolution in the material world, they did it in the world of ideas. So, according to Hegel, humanity was in the process of coming to full consciousness of itself. Basically a process of human evolution. The Hegelian slogan, the ideal becomes real. Humanity gradually coming into full awareness of itself. And Hegel had a quote, "In the realm of metaphysics, the I and the world cannot be thought of in opposition. Overcoming false opposition between the objective and the subjective, overcoming alienation with the world through historic processes." So Hegel's philosophy could be seen as a spiritual or mystical philosophy. Hegel wrote a lot about the German mystic Jacob Boehme, and there may be some connections there. He sort of like humanity is overcoming, he saw a primal unity with humanity overcoming alienation through clash of ideas, through a dialectic. His theory wasn't necessarily opposed to Christianity. He lived in Prussia at the time when it was a semi-theocracy. It was the Lutheran Church was the state church, and it was a semi-theocracy, so he had to be a little careful. He kind of incorporated Christianity in his theory of human evolution, progressive human evolution, so he wasn't necessarily anti-Christian. His philosophy is very compelling in many ways, and the time had a huge influence. Had an influence on Marx. Marx's early stuff. Karl Marx's 1844 manuscript is a lot about alienation and from our human essence. So Marx riffed off Hegel's philosophy of alienation, that humans, people, were alienated from our essence of being human under capitalism. We're alienated from this, what he called our species being in interaction with the physical, with the material world. And Marx had the idea that work, which is our relationship with nature and the universe, is a good thing, but it should be fulfilling and meaningful. People are alienated from the product of their labor. We have no connection with what we make or the value it produces. We just get a relatively small cut out of it to survive. Hegel's and Marx developed this a lot in his early work. Hegel's politics were a bit ambiguous. To an extent, he seemed like he was a radical. He sympathized with the American Revolution, the French Revolution, even Napoleon to an extent. Later in life, he seemed to tone down his radicalism. Prussia, where he lived, became more authoritarian, cracked down on liberals, so he maybe compromised a bit. Basically, the mainstream way of looking at Hegel's ideas of historical evolution is that modern liberal democracy is the highest stage of human evolution, according to this idea. Hegel was hugely influential, and there are widely different interpretations of it. There's like left, right, and centrist interpretations of Hegel. The right-wing interpretation of Hegel, which was the official interpretation, like 1820, 1830s, was that the Prussian state was the highest embodiment of rationality, was the highest embodiment of human self-realization. Yes, it sounds kind of silly, but that was the idea, that overcoming human estrangement with nature. Later, the fascists had some of the same ideas. Various Italian idealist philosophers had like fascist interpretations of Hegel. Some ideas were kicking around. At the time of Marx, there was another group, the left Hegelians, or sometimes the young Hegelians. They were a group of students at the University of Berlin. Marx was kind of drinking buddies with a lot of these people, and they delved into Hegel. They followed Hegel, but some of these people on the left saw contradictions in Hegel's philosophy. So Hegel seemed to indicate that the present stage of civilization, what we might call liberal capitalism, or the Prussian state of the early 19th century, was the highest stage of human self-realization. They thought this was silly. They saw more contradictions in this, that Hegel had left out a lot. There were some major blind spots, and the Hegelian process of development is still going on. There was a Hungarian Marxist philosopher, Lukács, George Lukács. He pointed out the contradictions of idealism. So idealism, that is, philosophy exists, or human struggle exists in the realm of pure ideas, is often the ideas of ruling classes throughout history. You got Plato in ancient Greece, or the Neoplatonist. Hindu philosophers are often idealists. Ruling classes don't want to get their hands dirty in philosophy. They don't want to recognize that these bad things exist, bad things in class exist. So bourgeois society, and our society today, often imagines it's the highest level civilization can attain to. They don't want to recognize it can be anything else. They don't want to think there's anything beyond what we have today. So as Frederick Jameson, a Marxist literary critic, once said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. So you get a lot of apocalyptic literature about the end of the world, very popular genre, but you don't have a lot of literature about it's the end of the world, what happens after, what happens beyond capitalism. Is there a way to prevent this? And people don't want to seem to think outside of these constructs and okay. So anyway, the centrist, the left Hegelians, who influenced Marx, were themselves influenced by utopian socialist ideas. Some of these people, some of these left Hegelians called themselves communists, but they were still abstract, the realm of theological. They were wrapped up in theological thinking, which they inherited from Christianity. Like, they were not Christians. Many of them were atheists or broke from Christianity. Some of these people, it's a very painful process, but they broke from Christianity, but they still had kind of a theological worldview, and they were still thinking abstractly instead of concretely towards, what layer of society could be the most possibility of moving society forward. They didn't really think in these terms. Marx broke from the left Hegelians. He had some bitter polemics against them. He was a Hegelian, but he turned Hegel on and said he was a materialist. He saw these historical change being played off through a collision of opposites, but on the material level, not some vague spiritual forces or pure ideas. He saw it in our interaction, or like he called our sensuous interaction with nature. So there's also dialectical. Hegel was a dialectical philosopher, and there are different versions of dialectics through the history of Western philosopher. The term dialectics or dialectical materialism was actually generally the philosophy of Marxism. It wasn't used by Hegel. It wasn't used by Marx. It was developed by Engels and collaboration with an early Russian Marxist, Plekhanov, who is considered to be a father of Russian Marxism. They developed the term dialectical materialism, but I think it does pretty accurately describe Marx's method. Definitely a method definitely used by Marx. There's zillions of contradictions. Marx studied or wrote about zillions of contradictions in the internal workings of capitalism, what he called the laws of motion of capitalism. Some example, in Marx talks about the contradiction, talking about commodities. Marx talks about the contradiction between the use value of a commodity and exchange value, and there's zillions of further contradictions from that, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Today, first, they're talking about left Hegelians and right Hegelians. There are also centrist Hegelians, which are still around today. An example of a centrist Hegelian is Francis Fukuyama. He was a State Department official, and he wrote a book, History and the Last Man, in the early 90s after the Eastern Bloc fell, kind of describing centrist Hegelianism, and that we had reached the final stage of history. This was it. And the Cold War's over, final rationality is finally won out, where we've overcome human estrangement and we can't get much better than this. After that, he kind of modified his ideas, and even recently he said socialism was good. He kind of modified a lot of his ideas and just didn't really make sense, because after the Soviet Union collapsed, it was a horrific situation for the people of Russia and Eastern Europe. Their living standard plummeted. So anyway, so Marxism, thumbnail sketch of it. Marxism isn't just capitalism is bad, but it's an analysis of the innate contradictions of the capitalist system. So Marxism, it's a bit hard to describe because it's a holistic method. It analyzes capitalism from several different directions. It describes society as a whole. Bourgeois social scientists often like to focus on one element, one angle of it. Marx saw it as an ongoing moving system with many parts. So I talked about earlier video, I talked about modes of production. So capitalism is a mode of production based on private ownership of the means of production. Capitalists produce commodities for the exchange market, and to stay competitive, a capitalist must extract as much labor from the workers as possible at the lowest possible cost. And Marx drew on a long line of several things, a long line of English economic thought, British economic thought. There was what they call the Scottish materialists, and influenced by them were two guys, basically founders of what's called classical economics, Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And these two guys developed labor theory of value, which were slightly different versions, and Marx used this as a big part of Marxism. Marx had his own version of it. According to Marx, labor theory of value, our labor power, which is our ability to work, not working itself, but our ability to work, is the source of all value under capitalism. There are different interpretations. Marx had his own interpretation. Marx argued that the economic value of a good or service is determined by what he called the socially necessary labor required to produce it. So the socially necessary labor time is the amount of labor time performed by a worker of average skill and productivity working with the tools of the average productive potential to produce a given commodity. This is an average unit labor cost measured in working hours. Okay, so Value translates to price in some complicated ways, but basically the value of a commodity, of a good produced for sale under capitalism, is created by the labor power, by the time. And this different workers work at different speeds, at different rates, and things like that, but they average out the socially necessary labor time. And so Marx pointed out that there's a lot of obscuring in capitalist society. You get the so-called titans of industry, people like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, a personality cult around him. Both these guys, except the early stage of their career, didn't create anything. Though their workers, including their designers, did everything. Really, Steve Jobs particularly was really good at using other people's ideas. There's this idea, I read that the cell phone, we know the cell phone was actually invented in the 1970s. The iPhone came out in 2005. It was using other people's ideas. But they were really great at making money of other people's ideas. So there's a lot of mystification around this socialist question, like, why can't workers innovate and do this themselves? Why do we need these people to do it? They don't actually do anything. Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, zillions of other people, Elon Musk, they don't actually do anything. They don't. They actually hire other people to do it. They have control over capital. They hire people to do it. They set the gears in motion, and they make money off it. Why? And they're billionaires. They're extremely wealthy people. Why can't we do without them? Why can't we democratically do this on our own? Why can't workers innovate and run things themselves? Now, Bill Gates, there's really great comics online. It's on Facebook. Existential comics. It's on about philosophy and has a Marxist bent. There's a really good website, good to check out. I'll provide a link for it below. There's a story a person wrote on their Facebook page. Okay, I'll read this. Bill Gates made his money by extinguishing free software and forcing us to pay him a tax just to turn our computers on. This was only possible because the state was ready to violently enforce his, quote, intellectual property. He didn't create a computer revolution, he destroyed one. There was a time when Bill Gates made his billions that it was impossible to buy a non-Apple PC that didn't come preloaded with Windows, and the cost of the Windows license was part of the cost of the PC, the computer. Microsoft coerced manufacturers, saying if they wanted to sell Windows PCs, they'd have to pay Windows license on their machines, even if their machines didn't. Even on their machines that didn't have Windows software. So even users who didn't want Windows were still paying for it. And Gates himself was a ruthless monopolist. He got in a situation where he could get control over the evolving technology and develop a monopoly on it. There were other ways it could have gone in. And so Gates was a ruthless monopolist. That's how he got rich. Not by making a product consumers chose to buy, but by eliminating their choice to buy any other product, which is why Bill Gates has been widely hated. Zuckerberg, more famous Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook, made his money in the exact same way, of course, by destroying a free, open social network. He was a guy at Harvard dormitory. There were these networks going around. He just got control of one. And so a social network like Facebook was bound to emerge. There was and is the open source movement. There are people sharing this. What Zuckerberg did was prevent this from following open protocols like email, so just anyone couldn't set up a server or socialize with it. So he took it out of the realm of democracy, de-democratized it, and created a monopoly on it. He became an extremely wealthy person. So to say these people added value to the world and therefore, quote, deserved their billions is absurd. They subtracted value, an enormous amount of value, and stymied progress to seize control and extract wealth. Computers and the internet would be more advanced if these guys had never existed, or other people would have gone on, done the same thing. But you could think of a non-capitalist society when these things, computers and internet and social media, could be much more advanced and a lot more fun if didn't exist under capitalism. And now, the state enforces their control. These people can do what they call intellectual property rights. So libertarians get it wrong. Libertarians feel that the problem is the government, the state interfering. The state interference in this. and why don't we just have unfettered market, things will work out. Well, there's a major contradiction in libertarian thinking. There's always the state. If there's less state regulation, there's actually just as much state regulation. State is enforcing intellectual property rights, and they're enforcing private ownership of property. And this is not a small thing. It's just as vicious as just as comprehensive state control as what we have now. So unfettered market competition requires massive government intervention to exist. So libertarians get it totally wrong. The state, even if you supposedly have small government, the state is still enforcing private property rights. They're just doing it in a different way, and they're always very strict about it. So there's state power always behind this, enforcing private control over what workers may themselves make. Anyway, back to the labor theory of value. As I was saying, value isn't created by supply and demand, which is supply and demand is basically a system of negotiation. The theory of surplus value starts from the idea that labor power is a commodity. Like you rent yourself out. You rent your ability to work for a certain period of time, and it's bought and sold at market rates, starting at the reproduction cost of the worker. Like, well, how much it costs the worker to stay alive for the next day, food, shelter, and so on. And there's more than that. There was the idea kicking around in the workers' movement of the 19th century, the iron law of wages, the idea that wages will never rise above the reproduction cost, and Marx totally disagreed with this theory, thought it was inherently reactionary, say, it's futility to fight for worker struggles, futile to work to raise standard of living of workers, because it just won't work. Marx disagreed with this theory. It's still popular among some anarchists today, believe it or not. So anyway, labor power, our ability to work, it's bought and sold like any other commodity. It's a commodity, but it's a unique commodity since it produces value. It produces more value than you pay for it. It's bought and sold like any other commodity, but it's a unique commodity. It's the only commodity which increases its value. It's the surplus value. So there's contradiction between the use value of a commodity, what you make, what you pay, and the exchange value, what you get. So according to a Marxist, the idea, the slogan of an honest day's pay for an honest day's work makes no sense. It's a reactionary slogan. No, there's no such thing as an honest day's pay under capitalism. We're wage slaves. And Marx said, in the simplest form of exchange, people produce commodities and sell them, so that they can buy other commodities to satisfy their needs and wants. In such exchanges, money is only the common medium that allows transactions to take place. Capitalists, in contrast, are motivated, not by a need for commodities, but by a desire to accumulate money. Capitalists take advantage of their power to set wages and working hours to extract the greatest amount of labor from workers at the lowest possible cost, selling the product of the workers at a higher price than the capitalists paid for them. Rather than buy or sell products at their true exchange value, as determined by the labor that went into making them, capitalists enrich themselves by extracting a surplus value from their workers. In other words, exploiting them. Marx pointed to the abject poverty of workers in places like Manchester, in England, the center of the Industrial Revolution, for proof of the destructive effects of this exploitive relationship. So there are different ways of estimating this, and like one estimate, 1 8-hour workday. For many workers, maybe the first 2 hours you've earned your keep. The rest of it you're completely working for the boss. So we have no control over this, over what we make. The story about Rolls-Royce workers, according to one estimate, Rolls-Royce cars used to be made completely by hand by very highly skilled workers. So the first 2 hours of their workday, they earn their keep for themselves. Now they are able to reproduce themselves. They pay what they earn their salary for the rest of the week. Really, the first 2 hours of the work week. The rest of that large period of time, the work week, they're working for the boss. It's expropriated. There are different ways of estimating this. So, capital. What is capital? So I talked about labor. Capital can be defined as simply dead labor. It's the machinery, the resources, the legal title to stuff, the knowledge, the intellectual capital, the knowledge, all ultimately produced by the workers. And capital that is it's created from our expropriated surplus labor, it's held against us. It's invested where it gets only where it gets a good return. Their boom and bust cycles are endemic to capitalism. You can't have capitalism without it. So capital is basically frozen labor. It's our labor power from the past. It's put into machines, put into investment, but it's our accumulated dead labor. It's often held against us. Everything capital is created by workers. It's not created by the leaders of industry or the oligarchs. So capitalism, and you can't have, there are innate contradictions in capitalism. Marx showed, many other economists showed, you can't have boom and bust cycles without you can't have capitalism without boom and bust cycles. People say we're due for a depression or recession, bad recession sometime now. There are periodic crises, there are overaccumulations of capital where old capital has to be destroyed, and it can be too much capital. Some of it has to be periodically destroyed where we can start all over again. There's cycles, and Marx analyzed that in the business cycle. So capitalism has expended a huge amount of effort into obscuring the basic workings of capitalism and to hide the labor theory of value, that labor power is the root of all value. This is a very threatening idea to capitalists. The idea, so it's deeply threatening to capitalism. So Adam Smith and David Ricardo and others developed what's been known as classical economics, which is kind of mostly our economic understanding of the world. Marx was influenced by this. He disagreed in some ways. He entitled Capital, or Das Kapital, as a critique of political economy. They were what they call the political economists, and a long line of thought from Britain and other places. And he was influenced by this, but he disagreed with it in some profound ways. He had the critique of political economics. Anyway, the modern economics as a discipline, as an academic discipline, and economics who work for companies, they are terrified of this. They're economics discipline. It's deeply, labor theory of power is deeply threatening to capitalist economics. So in the 1880s, the guy named Alfred Marshall developed marginal utility economics, which kind of focuses on supply and demand, etc. And it's called neoclassical economics, and our economics today is pretty much rooted in that. Enormous effort was expended to hide the labor theory of value. They don't go there. They don't want to go there. And it's true of a large extent of the bourgeois social sciences in general. They like sociology, anthropology. They want to hide a materialist viewpoint. They focus on other things, but they want to hide the labor power, labor theory of value, that workers create value. They want to hide the fact that the ruling classes are kind of arbitrary, that we don't need, they want to hide critiques of class society that was developed by Marx and Engels and many other people. They really don't like these ideas. Okay, so basically, under capitalism, you work so your boss is happy, so their boss is happy, so ultimately the investors are happy. It's true whether it's generally true whether it's a public or private company. It's based on the rule, capitalism is based on the rule of capital. Everything in society is ultimately geared to the reproduction of capital. Capital needs to be constantly active, constantly invested, or it's not capital. In the famous Marx quote, so increase. This is Moses and the prophets. It means keep making money. Under capitalism, human society is capitalism's way of reproducing itself. Human life itself becomes a commodity. And we can see this more and more in U.S. society. Now we have like many stadiums or schools or buildings named after companies or whatever. When I was a little kid, that was an absurd idea, but now we used to be Great Woods, like a concert in Massachusetts, a concert arena. Been there, really great place. I've been there for concerts. Now it's called the Gillette Stadium, and you see so many other cases. It's sort of bizarre. So anyway, okay. So I described something of the workings of capitalism, and okay, there are two most important classes in capitalism in constant confrontation with each other. There's the bourgeois, who are the owners of capital or the people who have control over it, and the working class, people who don't have capital or who don't control the means of production and so they have to sell their labor power to survive. There are other classes as well. There's like small business owners. There are petty bourgeois, small business owners, academics, managers, small entrepreneurs, so on. Their job generally, or managers' job generally, is to extract more surplus value from their workers. So if you work like a retail store, you have a boss. Often, I've worked in retail. In my experience, bosses don't actually do very much. What their job is to sort of hound their employees. They do scheduling and stuff, but they hound their employees, push them, get them to come to work, and get more work out of them, get more surplus value, so more and more work for their boss. And it's probably basically true of many enterprises. Like stuff I read, like retail sales, or many companies could work fine without a boss. Seriously, they could work fine. Workers could do it themselves. Democratically decide to do it themselves. You don't need a boss driving you, but under capitalism you do. A large part of a boss is to deliberately disempower workers and get more surplus value out of them. So the working class, having a working class, a class of people who don't own or control capital, didn't naturally occur in history. Working class had to be created over time, and Marx described this as a horrific process. In Volume 1 of Capital, he describes Scottish Highlanders, a particular Scottish clan. I believe that one character, the Duchess of Sutherland, who was the hereditary leader of the clan. And back in the Middle Ages, as bad as the Scottish clan system might have been, or tribal type societies might have been, which that was the survival of, there was communal, they protected each other, there was protection. So this Duchess of Sutherland, she became the hereditary leader. What she did, she realized she could make more money raising sheep instead of people. She forced her peasants, which she was theoretically supposed to be responsible for, kicked the peasants off their land, and the peasants weren't allowed to immigrate. Now, there are a lot of Scottish peasants, different times immigrated to Canada. Nova Scotia is heavily Scottish, if you've been there. North Carolina, they weren't allowed to leave Scotland. So this was deliberate. So these peasants kicked off their land, the communal land, where lived in horrific slums in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And this was the deliberate creation of a working class. So sheep became more profitable people, and similar process happened elsewhere. Marx described this the genesis of capital. He described this process. So now capitalism is a clash between workers and the bourgeois, the capitalist class. It's a constant struggle. So wage rates depend on the overall economy, the level of class struggle at a time, the amount of time we've been working, and so, okay. So this huge amount of time we've been working for the boss. We could be working fewer hours. We could be essentially working for ourselves, doing something more fulfilling. So essentially, a large part of our work is for wealthy parasites. Under capitalism, the productive powers of the human race are subordinated to the needs of a relatively few people to make a profit off of our labor. And there are zillions of innate contradictions from this, which I talked about. Things of benefit to society, like elder care, don't provide profits for capitalists, and they're neglected. Education is a battleground. Capitalists do need to have their workers have some level of literacy and some level of education, but not too much. So there's a battle between that. There are externalities, like things which the capitalists need, which is not profitable for a single firm or a single capitalist. So they're outsourced. The state takes over these and provides it for the capitalists, like education, sometimes transportation, other things, snow plowing. There's a battleground, like education is an example. National and local businesses are fighting against public education. In some ways, move towards charter schools because it's like trillion-dollar industry, the powerful movement in this country to privatize our public education system under both parties, Democrats and Republicans. It's about the Reagan era. There's a fight back, there's a pushback, it's contested, and also capitalists are not happy with employers having too many critical thinking skills. They want people know how to read and write and a few other things, and that's about it. People will be docile. So there are battles going on. There are battles. Okay, so yeah, so also the idea of advancing technology, there's a lot of publicity how advancing technology, robotics, or whatever, will create mass unemployment, which may happen. There's a lot of fear about this. A lot of Elon Musk or a variety of other people are talking about Andrew Yang, who's running for president. UB has a theory, UBI, have unilateral basic income, everybody, which, basically, the idea of mass unemployment would only exist under capitalism. Why not, the people being afraid of technology would exist only under capitalism. Why not just creating, so people terrified of mass unemployment? Why don't people, under a different system, people could welcome advancing technology, give people greater leisure time to do other things than drudge work. So under the contradiction, our productive power under capitalism is subordinated to the need of a small group of people at the top to make money off of our labor, to make profit off of our labor. And things, there are other ways society could be organized, and advancing technology could be a good thing. So also under capitalism, we have to constantly update our skill set, market ourselves. It's a horribly dehumanizing system. It's not based on human needs. And, the idea of income inequality, since Marx's idea that all value comes from the labor power of the working class, the bigger the capital at the top, the less for workers at the bottom. So billionaires, by definition, are stealing their money from working people. The more surplus they get control of, the less for the working class. So it's a contest. So people like the billionaires, Jeff Bezos, you hear a lot about, they're stealing it from us. Only we could do the exact same thing. We could get rid of Jeff Bezos and do what he's doing democratically and less abusive. Amazon fulfillment centers are horrific sweatshops from everything I've heard. So another aspect of Marxism is that the working class is that class which, in struggling to change their conditions, have the potential for transforming society. The working class ultimately is the engine of social change, since the workers are the creator of all values. Their struggles force ruling classes to accommodate, like the idea of the shorter working day, more shorter working day, like Marx described this, like 1840s or 1850s. There were agitation for first capitalists wanted to force their workers to work 12, 14 hours or all day long if they could. They can't because the workers will die, but they tried to force their workers to work as long as possible. Workers resisted it, and so after a huge contract like 1840s, 1850s in England or Manchester, the early industrial revolution, workers finally, they were forced to upgrade their method of technology so they could produce more. So they said to their workers, all right, we'll let you work 10 hours instead of 14 hours. Okay, well, we have technology to produce the same amount in that period of time. So it's a constant struggle and back and forth, and often forces capitalists to accommodate in some ways. Other times, workers have to accommodate. There's a pushback. It depends on the level of the class struggle, the militancy of workers. So there's also a symbiotic relationship. The two classes create each other, really. The class society is innate in capitalism. Now, it's been a little complicated to describe some of this. I'm just giving a thumbnail sketch because, as I said, Marxism is a holistic philosophy. It defines things in interaction with everything else. Nothing exists in and of itself. Everything in human society, and possibly in the universe, in the whole world, I don't know, but exists in relationship to everything else. And capitalism, or capital, is a social relation. It's not a thing. Everything is social relationship. Everything is constantly interacting with everything else. So this is most of bourgeois science, economics, sociology, history, whatever, looks at things more linear, more in a different way. So it's a different worldview in a lot of ways. So Marxism is materialist. People act in their class interests, and politics is the playing out of these struggles through history. And it's not a conspiracy. It's not that there's a small group of capitalists or a small group of oligarchs who are running things. That does occur, actually. But this class struggle is out in the open, but some of the inner workings are obscured. We've essentially internalized capitalist values. Example, like I worked in retail sales. It's routine for them to dump food or dump merchandise which doesn't sell, which is totally okay. They need to create scarcity. you're terrified. And I used to work for the Dartmouth bookstore in Hanover, New Hampshire. I love books. It was a fun job. For doing the first couple of months, it was a fun job. I think I was there a year and a half. They would dump books. They would just, books which didn't sell, they just throw them in the bin. And I'm a huge book nut. I would take armloads, drive behind the bin. There's a dumpster behind the bookstore. I'd drive there when no one was looking, and I would load up my car. The boss kind of scolded, saw me doing this, and he scolded. He couldn't stop me, but he kind of scolded me a little, like, you're not supposed to do it. Why not? I saved books. I was like a rescue operation. I saved books. Anyway, so if you ever worked in retail sales or any major business, it's a horrifically wasteful system. So, and also you hear, back there, tightening labor markets. Sometimes there's inflation, not so much now, but years ago when there's high inflation rates, economists talked about the need to tighten labor markets to prevent the economy from, quote, overheating. This basically create more unemployed people, make workers feel more insecure, and the underlying basis of this isn't really examined. So, also there's struggles between workers and capitalists. There are also constant struggles between capitalists. It's a highly chaotic system. No one can really control it. Capitalism is out of control. Their boom and bust are integral to the system. It's just, no. As far as politics, briefly, Marx's view of politics, as I said, he broke from the left Hegelians or young Hegelians. He thought they were too abstract. Marx started out as a radical Democrat, as a newspaper editor of a radical newspaper, which was closed down by the censors, and he moved towards the working class as the agent of historical change. Workers are the only class that produces value, and he became very heavily involved in the radical workers movement of the time. So Marxism developed within the context of, it wasn't just Marx, his ideas from great genius. His theory developed, Marx and Engels developed their work within the context of constant debates within the workers' movement. It was the workers' movement. Marx had opponents, constantly had opponents, who also had a following, people like Wilhelm Weitling, Proudhon, Max Stirner, various anarchists, Dühring, Lassalle, and many others. And there were fierce polemics back and forth, and they had an audience, was the mass workers' movement. Europe was becoming industrialized, and what do you do about this? What's the way forward for working people? There's a huge ferment, huge ideas in the early or mid-19th century. So if you read some of his early stuff, mid-period stuff, fierce polemics, the idea was that if you really value your views, as Marx did, you have a duty to fight for these views. And there were very fierce debates within this. Now, great movie. I really recommend it. It's called The Young Karl Marx by Raoul Peck. He's a leftist Haitian film director, lives in France. He's made a series of really good movies. It's basically how Marx became a Marxist. I think it's great for kind of understanding the basic Marxist worldview. Briefly, Marx joined this group called the League of the Just, which was a remnant of one of the earlier conspiratorial communist groups, which I mentioned. He renamed it the Communist League. It was a radical workers group. League of the Just originally had some spiritual or Christian ideas. There's a dramatic scene in the movie The Young Karl Marx where the banner is taken down. They have this banner called All Men Are Brothers. No, they took that down and replaced the banner with the saying, Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. All men under capitalism, all men are not brothers. They're, by definition, in a bitter struggle. And you need to recognize this. I mean, ultimately, in a better world, all people will be brothers and sisters, ultimately. But under the current system, they're not. And to not recognize this is dangerous and utopian. That was one of Marx's big breakthroughs. And so Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto for this group. Interesting story. They commissioned him to do it, and both these guys put it off for a really long time. And this League of the Just started writing, look, you guys have to get cracking, and we'll have somebody else to do it. So finally, they pushed themselves and they wrote it in 1848 at the last minute. It's a masterpiece of literature. The Communist Manifesto. It's a masterpiece of literature. It put forth the ideas I've mentioned, that labor is the source of all value, the product of workers' labor powers and expropriated. It describes how Marx and Engels broke with earlier conspiratorial traditions. There's a great line in the Communist Manifesto. It says, the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. I think that's a masterpiece. And so Marx built or advocated an open revolutionary workers' movement, no more of these conspiracies or occult groups, open revolutionary workers' movement. So Marx discussed in the Communist Manifesto, he discussed other interpretations of, quote, socialism, which had been kicking around at the time. There was resistance to capitalism, but it was some resistance to capitalism. Much of this was on a reactionary basis, what they call it aristocratic socialism. There's the idea of also peasant-based folk socialism, which started from reactionary premises, a peasant folk community. There's a famous passage from the Communist Manifesto where he critiqued various forms of socialism which were kicking around and opposed them to communism, which was workers' democracy, ruled by the workers at the workers, so in working to change their own condition can potentially transform society. So Engels was a collaborator. Friedrich Engels was a collaborator of Marx. In 1847, he wrote a really good critique of this a little while before the Communist Manifesto. It's called From the Principles of Communism, written by Engels in 1847. How do communists differ from socialists? The so-called socialists are divided into three categories. First, reactionary socialists. The first category consists of adherents of a feudal and patriarchal society which has already been destroyed and is still daily being destroyed by big industry and world trade and their creation bourgeois society. This category concludes, from the evils of existing society, the feudal and patriarchal society must be restored because it was free of such evils. The category of reactionary socialists, for their seeming partisanship and their scalding tears for the misery of the proletarian, is nevertheless energetically opposed by the communists. What Engels and later Marx was referring to, there was a movement in French literature, I believe around the 1830s, which we might say a type of feudal socialism, which deplored the horrors of the early Industrial Revolution, but looked back to a sort of medieval world where supposedly people cooperated in guilds and everyone knew their place, sort of a feudal socialism, and Marx and Engels really critique that. And they go on to say, and Engels goes on to say, as soon as the proletariat becomes revolutionary and communist, these reactionary socialists show their true colors by immediately making common cause with the bourgeois against the proletarians. Now, I don't know if that feudal socialism is still what it would correspond to today, but if the movement has any reflections today, it probably does. But I think what's really interesting is what Engels talks about bourgeois socialists and the next two categories. So bourgeois socialists, the next category consists of adherents of present-day society who have been frightened for its future by the evils to which it necessarily gives rise. What they want, therefore, is to maintain the society while getting rid of the evils which are an inherent part of it. To this end, some propose mere welfare measures, while others come forward with grandiose systems of reform which, under the pretense of reorganizing society, are in fact intended to preserve the foundations and hence the life of existing society. So I think this might, to some extent, fill people. This might describe people like Bernie Sanders or many social democratic parties today. They're really worried, and some billionaires today. They're really worried about income inequality and social polarization and growing radicalization. So they want to kind of ultimately maintain things. They want to prevent a revolution. So there are elements of this in many ideas of so-called socialists today. So Engels goes on to say, communists must unremittingly struggle against these bourgeois socialists because they work for the enemies of communists and protect the society which communists aim to overthrow. Okay, so I think the really important one is the third group, and this is very applicable today. Third group are democratic socialists. Finally, the third category consists of democratic socialists who favor some of the same measures the communists advocate, as described in question 18, I'm not sure of this, but not as part of the transition to communism, however, but as measures which they believe will be sufficient to abolish the misery and evils of present-day society. These democratic socialists are either proletarians who are not yet sufficiently clear about the conditions of the liberation of their class, or they are representatives of the petty bourgeois, a class which, prior to the achievement of democracy and the socialist measures to which it gives rise, has many interests in common with the proletarian. It follows that in moments of action, the communists will have to come to an understanding with these democratic socialists, and in general to follow as far as possible a common policy with them, provided that these socialists do not enter into the service of the ruling bourgeois and attack the communists. This is perfect. Bernie Sanders does a lot of this, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the DSA, social democratic groups. This is very close to them. Maybe a combination of 2 and 3. I think this is very appropriate for today. Engels wrote this like 150 years ago, but it's still appropriate today. So, it is clear, Engels goes on to say, it is clear that this form of cooperation and action does not exclude the discussion of differences. And okay, so Marx and Engels developed working class socialism as a means to human liberation. Marx described how class struggle was played out in mainstream of bourgeois party in the Communist Manifesto. Marx described how class struggle was played out in mainstream of bourgeois politics of the time, and communism was like a hidden specter, a ghost. Its possibility was implicit in the crisis, which is an integral part of capitalism, is terrifying to the bourgeois, and it still is today in the wake of the 2008 crisis. So communism is still, the ghost of communism, and it's even in its absence, is terrifying to the ruling class. It's the implicit alternative to the crisis we have today. So in Marx's writing, the Communist Manifesto, and later Civil War in France, when he described the Revolution of 1848 and the rise of Napoleon III, who was basically nephew of the original Napoleon, who made himself a comic opera dictator of France for 20 years. Marx described the political processes going on, and his influenced mainstream historiography. So, integral to Marx's political thought was the political independence of the working class, and it made an amazing analysis of the Revolution of 1848 in France and Germany, and the class bases of these revolutions, and how the bourgeois often would use the working class to force their own demands, and then they'd betray the working class as soon as they could. They'd suppress it themselves. So Germany, when Marx and Engels were working in the early part of their career, it was backward country. It was still, France and Britain were more developed. Germany had still elements of feudalism. There were 3 main classes. There were feudal holdovers, large landowners, which were part of like the right wing in Germany up until 1945. So feudal holdovers, the Prussian landowners. They were the bourgeois, the middle-class liberals, so-called the Democrats. They opposed these feudal landowners in the old archaic system. They were called Democrats. To an extent, they wanted liberal ideas. And then there was the working class. So the, quote, Democrats, who represented the bourgeois, the middle-class radicals, they became more fearful of the radical workers than they did of the reactionary landowners. And in Germany, they eventually capitulated. So the Revolution of 1848 in Germany, and in Europe in general, it flopped. It showed that the bourgeois, the class, was no longer capable of fulfilling their historic role. Like, as France, they did. The epic French Revolution from like 1789 to 1815, or one different ways of estimating it, was to some extent a bourgeois revolution, overthrow of feudalism. I mean, there was a bourgeois class for a long time earlier than the French Revolution, and there was a huge struggle before, like 1600s even, during the French Revolution for a while afterwards. It wasn't a one-time thing, but the French Revolution did represent a major transformation, and the landowners, the remnants of feudalism, had to be disposed of before society could further develop its productive potential. And the bourgeois class used workers and peasants for their own ends. Once they accomplished it, they brutally suppressed the workers. The Jacobins, the radical faction, had the La Chapelier laws that crushed labor unions, were fiercely anti-worker, and they were like the left wing of the French Revolution. So there are contradictions going on. The Revolution of 1848, by that time, the bourgeois class could no longer fulfill their historic role as they did in the French Revolution. So this time it would be up to the working class, and these ideas were more fully developed by Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky in his theory of a permanent revolution. Developed some of these ideas, and I'll talk about that later, maybe in another video. So after the revolutionary movements of Europe were crushed or collapsed, Marx ended up at the time, like Revolution 1848 and early 1850s, Marx ended up in England. Police were chasing after them. He wrote Capital, or sometimes Das Kapital. It was 3 volumes. He was going to write 5. He never quite did. He wrote 3 volumes, but they're both masterpieces. And he analyzed the inner workings or laws of motion of capitalism. And one really good explanation of Marxist economics, Marxist arguments. The YouTube series, and I'll provide a link to it, Capitalism 101 with a K by Brendan Cooney. I'll provide a link. I think it's really a good introduction tutorial on Marxist economics. So socialism is again ruled by working people. That's the overall idea. And I'm going to end this passage a Facebook friend wrote, which I think explains it very well. Okay, here we go. Now, in the United States, on average, the working class is paid 1/4 of all the wealth they produce. That part of that is taken in taxes and paying rent to landlords, which we will ignore for now. The other portion, the value of the workers produce, is taken by the capitalist class, which constitutes about 1/10 of the population. So the slogan, "We are the 99%," rolls off the tongue, but it was always wrong. That movement, the Occupy movement, is not quite, that slogan from the Occupy movement is not quite accurate. But so the working class constitutes about 2/3 to 3/4 of the population. We'll take the smaller number so as not to quibble. 2/3 of the people must divide up 1/4 of all the wealth they created. Well, 10% keeps 3/4. But even among themselves, there's a great divide, with 40% going to the top 1%. Another way to look at this is to think about the 8-hour day. Effectively, you produce everything you need for yourself and your family in 2 hours. Then you work for free until the end of your shift, 6 hours, give or take. So let me ask you this. If we got rid of the capitalists and just worked for ourselves, what would you do with these extra 6 hours a day?